Hey, what's up? Welcome to the first episode of my journey as a game developer. So, for the past couple years, I've been wondering the question, how hard is it to actually become a game developer? And more so, how hard is it to get a job in the games industry? And so I decided to finally take that leap and find out firsthand all of these things. So, in today's episode, what I'm going to be going over is everything I've done so far, what I've learned from all of that, and then all of my goals going forward. So, let's get right into it. So, I started my journey about 3 months ago, and although it hasn't been easy, I've learned a ton and gained a bunch of valuable experience with the kind of 4 games I've made. Alright, so just as a bit of background here, I don't exactly have zero experience in making games. I've been doing it as like a hobby off and on for over the past 5 years, doing very small projects and following tutorials that I thought were fun, but I've never set out to make anything too serious. I graduated college with a degree in computer science, which definitely comes in handy when developing games, so I don't need to start out learning to code from scratch or anything. However, there's many other hats that you need to wear as a game developer, and at the start of all this, it can feel kind of overwhelming. But no matter what you're doing in life, there's almost always someone who's gone through that exact same experience before, and almost always there's somebody that's uploaded that to YouTube. So, that's exactly where I started my journey. As you'd expect, there are a ton of awesome and super helpful people on YouTube willing to give a lot of great advice, from which I learned a few things. So, the first thing I learned was that I need to pick an engine to focus on. I'd already done a bit of development in Unity and Godot, but decided to go with Unity, at least for now, because it seemed that more game studios were looking for Unity developers rather than Godot. I think that Godot is a great engine, but as of right now, it's much more popular with indie developers than it is with larger companies, and my goal currently is to get a job at a larger company. The second thing I learned was that I needed a portfolio. So, having been a regular software engineer before this, just making websites, I didn't know much about portfolios or what they were, but after a bit of research, saw that it usually matters a lot more than your resume, and is absolutely necessary when applying to game studios to properly showcase all the work you've done. And kind of obviously, the third thing I learned was that you need to have games and or tech demos that you've developed to then add to your portfolio, which for the time being I had none. Fourth and finally, I learned that game jams are a great place to start because you can meet a lot of awesome people and create games to put on your portfolio through them. The problem was that I chose Unity as my engine of choice, and I'd been only doing minimal stuff in Godot for the past year, so I hadn't used Unity for a while, and I was rusty to the point where I really didn't think I'd be any help joining a team, and would also make a bad impression if a team was looking for more experienced people. So I decided to make something on my own instead to start. This was the first big mistake I made on my journey. At the time, I've been playing a game called Coffee Golf, where essentially a new golf course comes out every single day that you get to complete. I really like the concept of a game where a new level comes out every day and decided to try to make a mobile game that followed that concept. However, other than the one level a day part, the game concept I settled on was way, way larger than the scope I wanted for my first ever game, and I ended up sinking too much time into it, at least for the time being. I'm planning on completing this game later on, so I won't reveal exactly what it's about, but it did require 3D Procedural Island Generation with the ability to create as many biomes as you wanted to make for the islands and control what vegetation can appear in every biome and its frequency. For a very, very beginner game dev who at the time didn't even know how to code a basic 2D platformer level, I definitely screwed myself. And for the next 5 weeks, I was in the trenches trying to figure this out. I'll go into all the technical details in another video, but let me say that 3D Procedural Generation definitely had a learning curve to it. But here's my end result. I was really happy with this, and although it took me a fair amount of time because I was just starting out, I was super proud of what I'd created. and also had a ton of fun playing around creating a bunch of cool random islands. One of the problems I was running into though is that there are only so many free 3D environmental assets out there that fit the low poly style of my game, and I realized it would be really helpful if I knew how to use Blender. Honestly, Blender modeling wasn't too bad, although all the shortcuts are a pain in the butt to learn, but animating characters is definitely not fun to me. It made me realize that this is people's full-time job for a reason, and that I've never taken an anatomy class in my life before, and it shows. I spent about a week and change learning Blender. Thank God I found out about this website called Mixamo, because without Mixamo, I think I would have been actually cooked. But essentially, what this website does is it's by Adobe, and it's free, and you can just import your model in, select where all the parts of your model are, like your elbows and head and stuff, and it'll automatically animate your character with hundreds of free animations for you to choose, which saved me a ton of time, and I'll definitely use it in the future. So, it had been over a month at this point, and I realized that I had only finished the terrain generation for my game, and, well, I still needed a game. So at this point, I made the hard decision to put this project on the back burner for the time being, and that I would turn the island generation into its own tech demo to showcase later on. I had learned my lesson about scope and had a much better idea of what projects would actually be accomplishable by me and what wouldn't in a reasonable amount of time for a portfolio game. However, the bright side of all this was that I learned a ton from this project and felt a lot more comfortable with Unity, and finally decided to join my first game jam. I decided I wanted to do one as soon as I could, and chose one called the Axolotl Jam, which took place from November 24th at 1 p.m. to the 30th at 1 p.m. I chose it specifically because it was the soonest one I could do, and it didn't have a massive restriction like make a 3D shooter or implement this API for your game. I'm not saying those are bad kinds of game jams, but for my first game jam, I didn't want to overdo it like I just had on the 3D terrain generation stuff, and wanted a super open, non-restrictive game jam. So, one problem that I expected but ignored was that I chose a jam where Thanksgiving fell right in the middle of it. Except I was also coming back from a vacation on the 25th and had family coming back that I wanted to spend time with, and ended up doing the bulk of the work in one single night. So the theme for the jam was "The Night Changes Everything," and I got to work brainstorming a bunch of ideas. What helped me was I'd already decided I wanted to make a 2D platformer, because I figured it would be much simpler to make. And it was a pretty basic / core genre of game that I need to get some experience developing if I wanted to do this as a full-time job. I thought of a few ideas, but the one that stuck out most to me was one that I titled Solar Steve. Essentially, Solar Steve is this guy who has a solar blaster as a weapon, but the only way to get ammo for his gun / charge his gun is by using the solar panel he has strapped to his back to collect sunbeams that appear during the daytime. So the game would have a simple day / night cycle where you would race around a map to collect as many sunbeams as you could before nighttime hits and a wave of enemies start to spawn. I wanted to create my own artwork for this jam because I wanted to get a full understanding of the process of creating and animating game art, even if I wasn't going to specialize in it. This is when I realized that creating art for a game is very time consuming. And I'm not saying by any means that my game had amazing art. I mean, I literally took the frame of Steve running and realized it looked enough like him jumping to call it that. So big props to all the artists and animators out there. The last night of the jam, I realized I would have to pull an all-nighter in order to try to get something in by the time limit. I worked all night and was super exhausted by the end of it, but I had a kind of complete game. What I had was a fairly solid level, all of my art and animations, art for 3 enemies, although I only got around to implementing 1 during the jam itself, a full day night cycle, spawning slime enemies that you could destroy, and the amount would increase for each night played. Player controls for Steve, along with his blaster and ammo, and then UI components for telling what time of day it was and how charged your blaster was. I was super proud of what I created during the jam, but I kind of shot myself in the foot because I didn't try to build the game until the last second and upload it to itch.io, and of course it took longer than the time I thought it would take, and the time ran out to submit the game. I felt defeated, but I realized I'd still learned a ton once again, and I could always add more to this game and complete it later. I took a break for just a few days before joining my next jam named the Simplicity Jam. I was super excited for this jam because I was going to try to team up with at least one more person who hopefully had a little more experience than I did. That way I could try to learn from them. The jam was 2 weeks long, which I thought was a pretty reasonable amount of time to finish a good game in. And after searching a bit, I found a guy named Marcin to team up with. It turned out I got super lucky because Marcin has been a Unity developer now for 4 years and definitely knows a lot. The theme for this jam was Light and Shadow, which coincidentally was a very similar theme to the Axolotl Game Jam. But there was one catch for the Simplicity Game Jam. The way most game jams work is that they release the theme right at the start of the event. That way people can't get a head start on creating games before the event even starts. But the Simplicity Jam already had the theme publicly available and released a list of possible limitations that we had to implement at least one of them of when the jam started. There was a long list, but I immediately settled on the limited color palette limitation because art was hard for me to draw anyway, so this would hopefully save me and Marcin a bunch of time by giving an excuse not to overcomplicate the art. So in a way we kind of turned the limitation into an advantage, at least for us. Our initial idea for the jam was to have a simple top-down 2D stealth game where a player would wander through a procedurally generated dungeon, avoiding the light and enemies in order to find a key, and then make it to the exit door. I was in charge of the art, and I was pretty proud of this initial concept art I created for the game. I essentially wanted our main character to feel small and helpless, with no chance of fighting back against these massive looming enemies around him, kind of leaving him no choice but to want to cling to the shadows. We agreed it would be cool if the dungeons were procedurally generated, which once again was a lot more complicated than we thought it would be. Marcin thought the procedural generation concept was really interesting, so I let him tackle that stuff because, one, I was still a little bit tired of procedural generation, and two, there were a lot of other cool parts of the game that really interested me, like all the stealth mechanics we would need to create and the enemy AI. The first thing I needed to tackle was the player movement and animations. I left the movement pretty simple other than the roll mechanic with a cooldown timer. This made the player 10 times more fun to control in my opinion. It was pretty easy to implement. Overall, I was pretty happy with the animations I made for the character, but damn, that roll looked really good in my opinion. Next up, I needed to create a basic dungeon room for enemies to be placed in. Originally in my head, it made the most sense to make a few different room shapes/sizes, and then a bunch of different variations of enemies and lights that can spawn in each one of these rooms. That way we could kind of reuse the same room asset to create a bunch of different mini levels, and a random assortment of them could be stitched together with a few hallways by procedural generation. After I finished with the dungeon room art, it was finally time to create the enemies. Here's a small time lapse of me creating the 3 different enemies found in the game. I wanted the henchman as a kind of looming enemy that would just remain still, but stay in the light too long and they'll chase after you at a frightening speed. I then wanted one enemy type to be kind of a patrol enemy and created this old hunchback kind of guy with a flashlight that would just have set routes to go on. He'd be pretty easy to avoid, but if you get caught in his flashlight, you're instantly toast. I then wanted one last enemy that shoots projectiles. I figured a wizard with fireballs would be pretty good because 1, fireballs are light and if you touch them you die, and 2, the shadowy figure of a wizard looked mysterious, and that was the kind of vibe I was going for in the game. At this point, it was a few days before the game was due, and Marcin realized the procedural generation method wasn't going to work as well as we originally thought, and it would be better to hand make the levels. He asked if I could make the rooms I'd created into a tile set, as well as some hallways to go along with it, so we could use Unity's tile palette system to essentially draw the levels onto the screen. This was a pretty large task, but I never created a tile set before and figured this would be a great experience anyway. It turned out this was a ton of work. I realized the tile set we agreed upon of 96 by 96 ended up shooting us in the foot because we made it so there would be a ton of combinations in tiles that I'd have to create instead of just creating a small tile that just has a door or a wall in it, for example. So I'd have to create a tile with a doorway, wall, corner, and like a ton of other combinations. So just a note to myself and anyone else out there that will make a tile set, make sure you draw your tiles as small as you can, so that way you don't have a ton of combinations like I did. But hey, it was super cool to have our very own tile set, and being able to make our own levels so easily was a massive plus. At this point in the jam, I'd worked until the last minute on the tile set to make sure it was good to hand off to Marcin, because I had to go on a vacation and I didn't have time to work on the game the last 2 days of the jam. But, drumroll please, we got a game in on time! This made me super happy, and even though there was still a fair amount of bugs, this was a huge milestone for me. We settled on naming the game Mr. Cloak, and even though the game jam was over, I wanted to keep working on this project and make it into a full game I could release onto the App Store/Steam. I saw a fair amount of game companies wanted to see that you released a game onto an official platform, and I really liked what we were doing with Mr. Cloak and wanted to continue it. I let Marcin know this, and he was pretty excited and said he could keep helping too. He even got a musician to start making a few tracks for the game, which was awesome. I'd never worked with a musician before, and it was crazy how fast that he could create music and sound effects for us. And with the game finished for the time being, it was finally time to relax on vacation and celebrate the holidays. The one thing I did while I was away from my computer during this time was creating a long list of everything on Trello I needed to do, from fixing bugs to adding more features to Mr. Cloak. I started tackling all of these one by one as soon as I got back. Two of the coolest features I've added have been figuring out dynamic lighting, because before the lights were just static images that didn't interact with the world at all. And also, I added in pathfinding for the henchmen and the flashlight guy enemies, so they can accurately follow Mr. Cloak through hallways and around corners. And now if a henchman chases Mr. Cloak outside of the area that he's guarding, he'll pause for a few seconds before returning to his original position. Although Mr. Cloak was still my top priority, I really enjoyed meeting Marcin at my last game jam, and I wanted to see if there were any game jams in my area that I could attend in person. This is when I learned about the Global Game Jam. And essentially what that is it's an event that happens once per year all across the globe. This year it was happening from January 24th through the 26th. And luckily, one of the sites they were hosting it at was a college called George Mason that wasn't too far of a drive from me. I'll publish a full in-depth video of that jam because it was such a fun experience, but it was so awesome to finally meet other game devs in person and make friends with a bunch of them. I was part of a fairly large team of 6 people, consisting of 3 artists and 3 programmers. The theme of the jam was bubbles, which was pretty interesting, and we spent the first night just brainstorming. We came up with about 10 or so ideas, from a floor is lava platformer type game that takes place in a bubble bath, to a game about an economic bubble bursting. But we decided to settle on creating a local versus game that was set in the sea, where your characters all float around in their own little bubble, and you have to race around the map, collecting as many bubble items as possible to grow your own bubble so it's the largest by the end of the time limit. The catch is that projectiles also spawn on the map, and the larger your bubble is, the larger of a target you are to be able to get hit by one of the other players. And if you get hit, your bubble will pop, and it'll reset back to its original small size. It was so incredible working with actual artists. I was blown away with what they were able to create for us with such a short amount of time. Like, look at this awesome art. I was able to implement a bunch of features for the game, which I was pretty happy with, such as the local multiplayer co-op, a ready up screen, player movement, a home screen, dynamic follow for the camera, and design player controls for both the keyboard and the controller. By the end of the weekend, we had a pretty fun playable game, and I had a ton of fun and met so many awesome people. Here's one video from my teammate Quentin that recorded us doing our halfway checkpoint presentation to the other teams, right after I'd gotten the co-op working. A game where you kind of run around the screen. It's also a local multiplayer game. So you play with your friends, and you run around the screen, and you try to make your bubble the largest out of everybody's by the end of 1 minute. But the catch is that there's also projectiles, and so the larger you get, you're in the lead, but you're an easier target, so you have to like dodge other people's projectiles, and it's a whole thing. So we have a little ready up screen so far. Then you start the game, and then our spawning is a little screwed up. But we have, you can then run around. And we do have spawning.
Zoom out.
Oh, there we go.
There you go.
And we do have spawning, so if you run into a bullet, you can then fire it. And it works perfectly. And yeah, so you can then play with your friend. And so that's some of the background art. We have like a lot of background art. We just haven't fully implemented it yet. But we also have bombs as one of the items. Yeah, I think that's what we have so far. As you can see, we made a ton of progress from the halfway checkpoint to the game being finished at the end of the jam. For the week after this, I fixed a ton of bugs with the game and added/polished some more features of the game and added some necessities like a pause menu and scoreboard for the game. Alright, and that leads us up to right now, where I hope you keep following me along on my game dev journey. I will keep uploading videos about all the progress I make with Mr. Cloak and making the levels for that game, and the process of getting it onto the App Store, creating my Island Generation tool into a workable tech demo that all you guys can use, and then also just creating my portfolio so you can play any of the other games that I've created. Quick side note, but I know this is more of a overview of everything I've done so far, not really a lot of technical details of any of it, but if you have a technical question, please leave a comment about that and I will be sure to respond to you. And with that, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next episode.